and welcome. Policy Watch is back with a roundup of all the important economic developments of the week. Before I introduce my guest this week, here are the headlines. Soma panel gives the recommendation on indirect transfers. If implemented, could mean big relief for corporates. The IMF cuts India's growth projection, and in a double whammy, S&P warns of a possible downgrade. The finance minister junks downgrade chatter, says more reform measures to follow. And there seems to be no inking this nip. The National Investment Board sparks an internal debate within the government. Policy Watch breaks it down. Those were the headlines, and to discuss our top story this week, Ramesh Kumar joins us for the first time on Policy Watch. Mr. Kumar is a former Chief General Manager of India's largest lender, SBI, and now runs Asia Pragati Capital Finance. Welcome to the show, Mr. Kumar, for the first time. Let's just get started on our first story right away. Parthasarathy Soma, after giving his first report on GAR, has lost no time in submitting yet another report on retrospective amendments relating to indirect transfers. The proposed recommendations, if accepted by the government, will provide some relief to foreign investors besides giving a breather to global giant Vodafone. Here are the details. Take a look. A government-appointed committee on retrospective amendments headed by Dr. Parthasarathy Soma has favoured prospective application of tax law and a waiver of interest and penalty in case of retrospective application. That essentially means that companies liable for tax will have to pay the amount from the date of the decision and not the transaction date. This allows companies to be eligible to retrospective penalty waivers.
I think finally the common sense prevailed in the Soma panel report, because originally the GAR implementation, when it came and the retrospective effect, I think that didn't gel well with the industry as well as capital markets as well as global investors, because that will lead to so many legal litigation issues, and that has taken away a lot of investment climate in India. So people were not investing in India at all. People have actually lost interest in India. That has shown up in terms of the flows as well as GDP growth, overall sentiment. Now finally what Soma is saying is that let the common sense prevail, and whatever it might be, let us do it in the future. Let's not do in the past. Let's not open the past cases.
Key recommendations of the report are prospective application of tax laws. In case the government opts to apply the law retrospectively, it should waive interest and penalty. The report said that taxation of capital gains on indirect transfer should be restricted only to capital gains attributable to assets located in India. In order to provide certainty to foreign investors, the government should not impose capital gains tax on companies with a base in countries with which India has a double tax avoidance agreement. North Bloc has been concerned about the kind of message being portrayed to investors and wants to ensure a taxpayer-friendly regime to quell any fears of uncertainty regarding tax laws. The Soma Committee's recommendation seeks to allay the concerns of taxpayers and yet protect the tax base from erosion on account of indirect transfer of underlying assets in India. With Rahul Kapoor, Athar, RSTV. There you go. Mr. Kumar, first thoughts on the Soma, the latest Soma Committee panel recommendations on indirect transfers must come as a big relief to corporates like Vodafone.
Yeah, definitely it's come as a big relief to the corporate sector as a whole, Vodafone in particular. And I'm sure it has also come as a big relief to the, breath of relief to the finance minister, who, with the change in regime in the finance ministry, probably was doubting the wisdom of the last amendment.
Right, and the last regime, headed by the current president, Mr. Pranab Mukherjee, he came down hard on Vodafone as well. He said that the tax should be applied retrospectively. This new regime seems to have a different and more taxpayer-friendly view. Wouldn't you think?
Yes, I think this regime has a more pragmatic view of things. What was argued earlier by the government was that no company can get away without being taxed in either territories if there is a cross-border transaction. Broadly, that makes sense. But to implement a retrospective tax law amendment to enforce this is not a very wise way of going about it. It does damage the confidence that international investors have and even Indian corporates have in the stability of the policy regime in India.
Right. I'd like to quote a couple of lines from the report here. He said, the Parthasarathy Soma, that report now says, the provisions relating to taxation of indirect transfer as introduced by the Finance Act 2012 are not clarificatory in nature and instead would tend to widen the tax base. This is what Shom said immediately after he released it to the public. Would you tend to agree with him? It's not very clarificatory?
That is right. It is not at all clarificatory. As a matter of fact, it is targeted at garnering some tax retrospectively.
So you would obviously tend to agree with him that this is what is needed right now to get investor confidence back. Also, taxation of capital gain on indirect transfer should be restricted only to capital gains attributable to assets located in India. This is what the report also says. The capital gains, it suggests further, should be taxed on a basis of proportionality between fair market value of the Indian assets, the global assets of the foreign company as proposed in the DDC bill. This will certainly provide, if implemented, if these recommendations are implemented, this will certainly provide the kind of certainty that investors really want, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. I think the last measure of the finance minister had really rocked the boat. Probably if we had gone by the judicial pronouncements and practices, probably that is what would have happened. But by changing this retrospectively, it completely upset the apple cart. And now, this with this committee recommendation, which I am sure the government will accept, and of course look at measures of implementing it, this really brings stability and some sense of understanding and consistency back to the government's policy.
Right. Let's talk about the capital gains tax issue. He's also mentioned in this report. The rationale is that in order to provide certainty to investors, this committee came up with these two, especially the one recommendation on capital gains tax. Now, the government, it says, the Shom committee says, should not impose capital gains tax on companies resident in countries with which India has a DTA or double tax avoidance agreement. If that is implemented, don't you think, as some people would suggest, that would be yet another loophole that tax fraud could come in through that loophole?
Not really. If you look at today's globalized economy, companies are doing business transborder. They are looking at generating revenues in multiple geographies, and they are looking at the tax efficiency of their businesses also. If there is a lower tax regime, and they are able to generate more revenues there, I think that's perfectly legitimate. And as long as there are double taxation treaties and taxation happens in one territory, I think non-avoidance of taxation in the other territory is a very well accepted international policy, and I think this would be consistent with that.
Like looking at the Shom committee overall, it came out with a report on GAR first, and now it's come out on this report. The man himself is being, Mr. Chidambaram has charged Dr. Shom with coming out with having a newer look, a fresher look at all tax laws in the country. Do you think that first report, GAR, was made public, suggestions were invited, now this report comes in. Do you think passing it and implementing it is just a formality now? Do you think these recommendations will be passed?
Not really. See, it is not going to be that simple. Considering the overall political scenario now, the government would need to take a little bit of an extra effort to get this passed. But it would be wise not to wait for the next budget, but to actually make an attempt and pass this amendment through right now. Because as far as even political parties are concerned, I think there is not too much of a divergence on the opposition to this amendment even otherwise. So government should not really have too much of a trouble passing this amendment.
But do you think with the assembly elections coming up and the winter session of parliament, do you think it's going to function like the government wants it to function? Do you think there will be enough consensus on reports like these and recommendations like these?
The government will necessarily have to hammer out a consensus, and I think this finance minister is quite focused on rolling out a measure of reforms which had been really log jammed for almost 3 years now, and to ensure that these are pushed through. And he has very categorically stated that we would have to have a dialogue with the major opposition party to.
So Mr. Chidambaram is the right man to do it. If anyone is the man, he is the man.
Absolutely.
On that note, sir, we'll take a break. We'll come back with the next story after the break. More with A. Ramesh Kumar on the other side of this break. Welcome back. Now, despite big ticket reforms and a number of others on the anvil, the government's reform initiative doesn't seem to be cutting much ice with the International Monetary Fund, or IMF. The international lender has cut its forecast for the fiscal year 2012-2013 to 4.9% from 6.2% in July this year. The IMF's latest World Economic Outlook report released in Tokyo ahead of the IMF World Bank annual meetings cited that the growth has weakened in the first half of the current year due to deteriorating business sentiment and stalled investments due to governance issues. In a double whammy, rating agency Standard & Poor's also warned that India could face a credit rating downgrade if reforms are slowed down and India's external position deteriorates. Mr. Kumar, the report is titled Asia Pacific Sovereigns, a Bit of Stability in a Sea of Uncertainty. Would you say it's a correct title, an apt title and a correct assessment going further?
Yes, if you look at the world economic scenario, I think it's a pretty apt title because the US is struggling to make its economy work, to generate some employment. The Eurozone is in the middle of a crisis. They're trying to retrieve the situation. Japan is having a fairly weak growth. It has not been anything which would be called an engine of world economic
and
growth.
Our growth has weakened as well.
Yeah, but
India
Asia still has much higher average rate of growth than Europe or US or the global average as a whole. So from that point of view, yes.
But do you think that let's talk about the S&P warning first. Now they came out and said, oh, India could be downgraded if it continues to be slow on reforms. On the other hand, our finance minister, Mr. Chidambaram, says shed all self-doubt, and he doesn't really agree. He's junked all these claims, saying that no, we're going to progress like the way we planned. He's also telling industry now, Mr. Chidambaram, is that we should shed all fears and get the fear of a downgrade out of our heads. Now, industry is wondering, Mr. Kumar, that who should we listen to? Our finance minister, who's all gung-ho about it, IMF, who's not very keen on it, or S&P, who's immediately warning of a downgrade? Who should industry listen to?
See, the rating agencies, I must confess, do not have a very great track record of proper predictions.
A dubious record, if you could.
Yeah, would be a little stronger word, but yes. So they are now being a little more cautious and are trying to give warnings a little ahead of time possibly. And S&P had already given this warning.
Yeah.
A slew of measures have been announced now. I don't think there is any other negative data or information which has come in which would really contribute to reinforcing that, except possibly the fear or anxiety that the reforms, which are definitely going to make an impact, the impact and they are very positive, that they are not rolled back. This could be more against a warning against rollback than a warning of actual downgrade.
Could this also be perceived as a sort of a pressure bubble building, both domestic murmurings and international, let's just call it friendly advice from ratings? Could this be perceived as angling for more reforms and milking the government for all it's worth? Would you agree with that?
They would always, yeah, that will always be that angle. But I think the real thrust of this is India needs reforms. It needs structural reforms. It needs fiscal deficit control. And these set of reforms, some have been announced. Probably there are more which need to be really put on trail. And that these should not be rolled back because India has a track record of rolling back a lot of reforms.
Right.
So I think it is more a warning and an anxiety being expressed about that.
But nothing much to fear. Like Mr. Chidambaram says, you shouldn't really...
No. Personally, I don't think there is much to fear because after the original S&P warning, and the others also did warn, the other rating agencies, I think some very impressive reform measures have been announced. And the finance minister has made it very clear that it is not stopping here. There are more reforms to follow. The focus
and he's announced insurance as well.
Absolutely. So I think with this series of reforms happening, I don't think any rating agency would really try to downgrade when positive things are happening in the economy.
Let's talk about the markets for a bit. The markets were rattled day before yesterday, on Wednesday, when the IMF came out with this report, then the S&P warning. I think the Sensex that day fell about 162 points. It did rally back, recover back, but this is not the kind of chatter that industry and especially markets want to hear right now. They're finally rallying back and finally the rupee is strengthening against the dollar. This is not the kind of chatter we want to listen to right now.
Yeah, but then the policy paralysis in India has happened for so long, and because of this we have lost certain percentage of growth and the capital investments happening in the country, that probably a warning that we need to be on this track for a consistently long period, I think is probably quite welcome. And from that point of view, probably it is well intentioned, because we have still not tackled our fiscal deficit. Yes, certain reform measures have been announced, which is good. The policy paralysis seems to have dropped off. But what about the fiscal deficit? What about the current account deficit? These have not been tackled in real terms. The inflation is still pretty high and still needs to be brought down. Supply side interventions need to be stronger. So if looking at all of these things, these set of measures alone are not the panacea. There is a lot more to be done. And from that point of view, I think this warning is, I think, nothing
It's
unusual.
interesting you mentioned the fisc. Now, S&P warning also mentioned that the fisc could go up to 6% of GDP. Do you agree with that assessment? Because nobody else seems to.
If we do not come up with any disinvestment, it could very well happen that it would go up. So there needs to be funds created. Of course, the government is, the finance minister particularly, is looking at more innovative ways of doing it. He's trying to take stock of what are the idle assets of public sector units, land assets, other assets, how these can be sort of sold and additional money garnered apart from the disinvestment process itself. So I think a lot of novel ways of generating revenue to meet the deficit is necessary.
Structural, of
If
course,
that
you
happens.
mentioned structural reforms as well, and the efforts that the finance minister is putting in disinvestment as well. It's interesting you mentioned that, because the target of disinvestment this year as well is around 25,000 to 30,000
30,000
crores.
crores.
And I think the first issue this year is RINL, Rashtriya Ispat Nigam Limited. Do you think that target is achievable? Because last time they could only achieve less than half of the target. And do you think this time around the target is the same, 30,000 crore, but no big ticket no big ticket scripts this year, no ONGC, no Coal India, all of them are small. Do you think that target can be met?
I think so. I think this time the market will not be flooded with too big an issue at a time. From that point of view, I think the capacity of the market to absorb these issues would be better. Second, there is already an reversing of the sentiment. Sentiment is improving. We have seen the Sensex, the Nifty go up to a very significant extent. And if the government can keep on giving the confidence that the government is continued to be focused on reforms, I think they should be able to get this amount of money in.
So you're positive that 30,000 crore can be met?
Yeah, more or less. I think
So that's a very positive thought, sir. I think one of the first guests on the show who actually agreed that 30,000 can be met. So that's something to think about. My last question to you on this story, of course, you mentioned the FISC, you mentioned the current account deficit as well. Subsidies is one thing that the government has to tread very carefully on. It has political connotations as well, and it's a very thin line, or a very thin line that the government has to walk. The Kelkar committee report, the Kelkar panel just came out and advocated a very harsh approach towards subsidies. Do you think the government can actually afford it politically and otherwise? And do you think that the government will stick to its populist subsidies, even though they've raised the rate of diesel as well as cut subsidies on LPG?
yes, I think this is a very difficult area for the government to tread, particularly now with a lot of elections in the offing. The government would not do anything very major on cutting of subsidies, except some realignment of the diesel prices, LPG prices have already been done. I think that is bold enough to start with. And looking at the Indian context, where agriculture sector reforms have not really taken place and the infrastructure development has not reached the rural areas adequately, probably cutting of subsidy may not be even fair to the sector. So there are a lot of other implications to be studied before that can be done. So I don't think it is going to happen in the short term.
Right.
So what would have to happen is cutting down other costs, the non-planned expenditure otherwise, and bringing in disinvestment.
That's the key, really. The non-planned expenditure always kills us. So we have
Yeah, I
to be
think we
careful
need
on the
to
non-planned
concentrate.
expenditure. On that note, we'll take another break right now. Policy Watch returns on the other side of the break. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back. Now, Environment Minister Jayanti Natarajan has written to the Prime Minister Manmohan Singh strongly objecting to Finance Minister P. Chidambaram's next reform-oriented move, setting up of the National Investment Board to fast-track big-ticket projects. Now, North Block strongly believes that NIB is necessary as many big-ticket projects have been held up due to inordinate delays in getting approvals from different ministries. Once the NIB has given its nod to a project, no ministry will have the power to raise objections. Policy Watch spoke to Soma Banerjee, National Policy Editor of the Economic Times, to break it down for you.
The government is facing a lot of opposition on the issue of setting up of a National Investment Board. And to talk more on this, I have with me Ms. Soma Banerjee, National Policy Editor, Economic Times. Welcome to Policy Watch, ma'am. There's a lot of opposition within the government on the issue of setting up of a National Investment Board. The ministers are writing to the PM on the issue. Is the government facing a war within?
Yeah, so any change actually comes about with resistance, and this is only natural because this kind of a board is actually going to take away the powers of some of the ministries. The whole issue is about faster clearances for infrastructure projects, and therefore the government has proposed that they have a special board almost on the lines of the FIPB where clearances are taken within a time frame period. Now, naturally, ministries which are actually delaying these or are actually not moving as per the time frame which is put out in the policy are not happy about this. You have protests from the Environment Ministry, the first one, Ms. Jayanti Natarajan, who has written to the Prime Minister. But as far as I understand, this is a step which needs to be taken because if the economy needs to come back on growth, they need to take faster decisions within the time frame that is set about in the policy.
Is the setting up of a body such as the NIB the only way out to fast track big ticket projects in sectors like infrastructure and power?
Well, you know, what we have seen over the past few years and over the past few months is that most of these projects are stuck because of interministerial differences or lack of coordination. Now, what does a board like an NIB do, or a National Investment Board, which has representation from finance, from law, from environment, and from the Prime Minister's office? So what they do is to actually iron out the differences between these ministries and help in better coordination. So while this may not be the only possible way, I'm sure if ministries were actually working on time and there was enough coordination, you did not need this. But certainly it looks that these things are creating problems, and therefore this is one of the best ways that is at the moment being offered to fast track the projects and get investments going in the infrastructure sector.
It is against the spirit of the Environment Protection Act that investment board overrules environment concerns. So do you think that certain ministries such as the Environment Ministry should be kept out of jurisdiction of the National Investment Board?
First, I think we need to clarify that the Environment Ministry is not outside the purview of the NIB. The Environment Ministry is actually a part of the of the NIB. The Environment Minister is a part of the National Investment Board. The only thing that this board is going to do is to see that decisions are taken within the stipulated time. It's not about taking decisions without their consideration. Second, I think there have been allegations by the Environment Minister in her letter to the Prime Minister, as has been reported, that there are projects which get clearances and then don't move on their work. Now that is something which the Environment Ministry really needs to look into. Maybe a regulator also can help over here. The people who are squatting with environment clearances but then not doing anything on the projects, there is a case to be made against them. But that does not stop the ministry or the government from looking into genuine projects and to clear those clearances. At no point, I think, is the government or the Prime Minister or the Finance Minister or anybody in the government saying that environment is not an important issue in the whole scheme of things.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for talking to Policy Watch. So we heard the National Policy Editor of Economic Times, and she said that it is high time and the National Investment Board should be set up as soon as possible. That's all I have for now. Back to you in the studio.
Thank you. Rahul Kapoor there with Soma Banerjee, the National Policy Editor of the Economic Times. That's all the time we have on Policy Watch this week. I must thank my guest, Ramesh Kumar, for coming on the show. I hope you come back again very soon. The first story on Policy Watch this week. The Soma panel gives yet another recommendation on indirect transfers. If implemented, my guest agrees with me that it's a big relief for corporates like Vodafone as well, and investors kind of looking for certainty. This particular recommendation, these two recommendations, one on capital gains tax and one on indirect transfers, if implemented, will of course give that certainty to investors. The second story on Policy Watch this week, a double whammy for India. IMF cuts India's growth projection, and Standard & Poor's rating agency also warns of a possible downgrade. The finance minister says shed all self-doubt. He said that industry is moving in the right direction. He says more reforms are coming, and of course we tend to believe the finance minister more than we tend to believe S&P or IMF. third study, of course, was on the NIB, the National Investment Board. You heard Soma Banerjee say that this is the right time to get such a body in. There have been delays in big ticket projects and big ticket mega infrastructure projects as well, and this is the right ticket to go about it. Of course, the Environment Ministry and its concern have to be addressed, but that, of course, will happen because the Environment Ministry and the Environment Minister will be part of the NIB. That's all the time we have on Policy Watch this week. Athar Khan saying goodbye, good night, and thank you for watching.